Okay, let's unpack this. When we typically talk about making significant physical changes like weight loss, the conversation usually fixates on the mechanics, right?
Totally. The calories in, calories out, the exercise routines,
Hmm.
the pure biology of it all.
But what happens after the physical transformation? What's the landscape sort of beneath the numbers in the scale?
That's exactly the terrain we're digging into in this deep dive.
Hmm.
We're drawing insights from some really powerful reflections uh, inspired by the work of Dan Hollis.
Ah, Dan Hollis.
Yeah. And he presents this concept that kind of flips the script. Weight loss is biology. Staying there is narrative.
Staying there is narrative. Wow. That phrase immediately shifts the focus, doesn't it?
It really does.
It tells us this isn't just about the physical stuff, it's about the story we're living inside. So this deep dive is based on notes and reflections that really zero in on that psychological side.
The narrative journey that unfolds after the weight comes off, and crucially, how you navigate the inevitable bumps along the way.
Right, the bumps.
Exactly. So our mission here is to get past that surface level chat and understand the deeper story, the identity shifts, those moments of confusion,
Yeah.
and the tools you actually need to navigate that long-term journey successfully. Especially maybe when the familiar noise of physical hunger isn't the loudest thing in the room anymore.
Okay. So the sources suggest that this deeper story really kicks off once the physical changes happen. Like you might look in the mirror and, okay, your clothes fit differently.
Maybe better than ever.
Right, better than ever, but there can still be this strange feeling of not quite recognizing the person looking back.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
The physical form has changed, maybe dramatically, but the internal story, that sense of self, it hasn't necessarily caught up yet.
Mm.
And this brings up a really crucial, often kind of unacknowledged experience that Dan highlights, what he calls identity grief.
Identity grief. Tell me more about that.
It's that quiet realization, like, wow, I had no idea who I was without that weight. For so long, that weight, maybe that whole relationship with food, it got tangled up with your identity,
Even if it was a source of pain.
even then. So when it's gone, there can be this unexpected sense of loss, almost like a void where something familiar used to be.
Even while you're celebrating the change.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's complex, and it's a deeply personal thing that you rarely see captured in the typical, before and after photo narrative.
Identity grief. That really resonates. It's like the silence that can follow the victory party. And you mentioned hunger. The sources say it doesn't just vanish, it shape shifts. What does that look like?
What transforms into something different, right? That old physical hunger might fade, sure, but it could show up as memory.
Memory. How so?
Like reaching for old comfort patterns just out of habit, even when you're not physically hungry.
Right.
Or it becomes confusion trying to navigate life's stresses and emotions without that familiar, maybe automatic coping mechanism.
The automatic response.
Yeah. And it leaves a space, a void, really, that used to be filled with thoughts of food, planning meals, managing cravings.
This constant mental chatter.
Right. And that space, it needs to be filled with something new, something genuinely nourishing for the self, not just the body.
That makes sense. And that transformation explains a key teaching from Dan that I found really insightful. People don't relapse into hunger, they relapse into confusion.
Yes. That's such a critical distinction.
It's not usually like a sudden, overwhelming physical craving that trips someone up after a big change.
Not typically, no. It's more about struggling to navigate this new psychological terrain, this new identity, this new way of being in the world where the old default, the old coping strategy isn't available or even necessary anymore.
So the breakdown isn't really a failure of willpower against hunger.
Exactly. It's more like the system defaulting back when the old framework is gone and the new one hasn't been fully built yet, or it's still a bit wobbly.
Right, it's still under construction.
Which is where this idea of actively building and scaffolding comes in. You're not just removing something. You have to construct something new in that space where the old pattern used to live.
So you're consciously, like, stitching new rituals and responses into the fabric of your daily life.
Precisely. New habits, new ways of handling stress, new ways of thinking about yourself.
Building scaffolding. Okay, so you're not just leaving an empty space. And the sources really emphasize that support is absolutely critical here. They describe it as neurobiological scaffolding.
Non-negotiable.
Oh, great.
Seriously. Think of your brain like learning to walk differently. Maybe even stand upright for the first time without leaning on something heavy,
Yeah.
Having a support system provides that external structure while your internal architecture is being rebuilt, It's
Yeah.
fundamental.
So when those loud biological signals quiet down,
That's when the psychological and narrative work takes center stage. And that work is incredibly challenging, maybe almost impossible to do totally alone.
and this is where tools like semaglutide come into the picture, as mentioned in the sources.
Right. They could provide a really significant pause, or a silence maybe,
Hmm.
from that constant physical appetite noise.
Yeah.
They can reduce the sheer volume of physical craving.
Which sounds incredibly helpful for breaking old patterns.
Oh, we can be. Profoundly helpful.
Yeah.
But Dan offers a critical caution here. In that quiet, there's a potential danger.
Danger.
Well, he says, in that quiet, the stories we've buried tend to rise. Without the immediate distracting noise of physical hunger or cravings to manage.
Uh-huh.
The deeper stuff, the unaddressed emotional issues, the old narratives about self-worth, the reasons food became a coping mechanism in the first place, that stuff can surface.
Ah, okay. So the silence lets other things be heard.
Exactly. And that's precisely why support becomes even more structural when the biology is quieter. You need that scaffolding to help you process what emerges in the silence.
When the cravings stop, the truth begins. That quote from the source material is incredibly powerful. It really highlights that the physical part is just the kickoff.
It really does. Dan's teaching seems to be that the true, deep, transformative work isn't just about starting the weight loss process. It really begins when you reach a point where you're no longer using food to explain or soothe or manage your feelings.
When that automatic link between emotion and eating starts to break down.
Yes, that's the turning point.
So you could have amazing biological results. The weight comes off beautifully, but the sources caution that biology will give you results that psychology will dismantle.
If you neglect that essential psychological and narrative work,
Right.
that's the core vulnerability right there.
Makes sense.
You can change the body, sure, but if the underlying story, the identity, the emotional regulation skills, the coping mechanisms, if those haven't shifted too.
Then the conditions that led to the weight gain in the first place are kind of still lurking.
Exactly. The physical changes are then built on a shaky foundation. And that's why what Dan offers, it seems, isn't just another diet plan.
It's more than that.
Yeah, it's language, scaffolding, and narrative memory. It's about providing the tools to understand what's happening inside, the support structure you need for change, and the ability to build a new, more empowering story.
The ultimate goal, then, is helping people come home to themselves.
That's how it comes across.
Yeah.
It's fundamentally about learning to live differently, not just eat differently.
This journey isn't about eating less, it's about living more. That really sums it up beautifully, doesn't it? It's a complete shift in perspective from the usual focus.
Absolutely.
Now, the sources also dig deep into another really critical part of navigating this new landscape, how we handle failure or setbacks.
Ah, yes, reframing failure.
Yeah.
That's huge. The notes reflect on the common way we used to see setbacks,
All right.
like proof of weakness or a lack of discipline.
Or evidence that you're fundamentally broken or just not cut out for this.
Yeah, that you're incapable.
Right.
Which is just an incredibly heavy and, frankly, counterproductive way to view a misstep.
Totally. But Dan completely reframes this.
He really does. He offers this perspective. Failure isn't the end. It's a message, a moment of feedback.
Feedback, not judgment.
Exactly. And sometimes, he says, it's the most honest conversation you'll ever have with yourself. Instead of a judgment, he sees it as data. Pure data.
Something to observe with curiosity, like, okay, that didn't go as planned. What can I learn here?
Right. It's an opportunity for self-reflection, not self-condemnation.
This connects right back to the idea of relapse, doesn't it?
It does.
Instead of seeing a relapse as some kind of personal betrayal or sign, you've ruined everything.
He frames it more like the brain asking for the old familiar rhythm. It's not a moral failing. It's the brain defaulting to a pattern that's deeply wired in.
Especially when you're navigating all the inherent confusion and newness of that post-weight loss world.
Absolutely. So the failure isn't necessarily in the method itself, but often in failing to prepare for what comes after it.
Failing to anticipate the psychological shifts, build that new narrative, reinforce the scaffolding.
Exactly. Failing to prepare for the narrative part of the journey.
And the sources point out that if you experience a setback, or maybe a breakdown in progress, it often means the support system the scaffolding needs reinforcing.
Right. It doesn't automatically signal that the person themselves is weak or incapable.
That's a huge shift. It means look at the support structure first. Don't just blame the person standing on it.
Exactly. And that perspective makes setbacks feel much less devastating, much more manageable.
It allows you to view them differently, maybe even, as the sources suggest, as sacred setbacks if you approach them with curiosity instead of immediate judgment and shame.
Yeah, sacred in the sense that they hold valuable information.
Hmm.
Because as this quote goes, the shame isn't in failing. The shame is in pretending you were supposed to be perfect.
Oof, that hits home. Nobody's perfect.
Nobody is. And that self-compassion, that acceptance is vital. It leads directly to this concept of building grace into the process.
Grace. Okay, define grace in this context. What does that look like?
It's essentially how you respond when you stumble. So instead of that automatic reaction of blaming yourself, blaming the plan, blaming your circumstances,
Which is so easy to do.
so easy. Instead, you consciously choose to reach for a different tool. You ask yourself, okay, I stumbled. What did I learn from that? What do I need right now, in this moment, to get back on track?
So you respond with learning and maybe self-care instead of judgment.
Precisely. That's grace in action in this context.
And that circles back powerfully to the narrative you're building about yourself, right? The
Mhm.
sources emphasize asking, what story am I telling myself about this failure?
Yes. And critically, is that story helping me become who I want to be?
That question is fundamental, isn't it?
Absolutely. Is the internal dialogue you're having about this misstep keeping you stuck in the old narrative of being flawed or broken? Or is it actually empowering you to learn, adapt, and keep building the story of the person you're becoming?
By reframing failure this way, seeing it as feedback, a moment for grace, a chance to learn, it just fundamentally changes your relationship with challenges. It teaches you how to fail forward.
Exactly. Fail forward. And as these notes suggest, learning that skill, how to navigate setbacks with curiosity and grace, how to genuinely learn from them and keep moving that ability might just be the most significant and lasting transformation of all.
It feels like a life skill, truly. It applies way beyond just this one journey.
Totally. It's applicable everywhere.
So bringing it all back to that core message from Dan Hollis that inspired these insights, this journey isn't about eating less. It's about living more.
Mhm.
It's about consciously building a life, a narrative, and an identity that fully supports the physical changes you've worked so hard for.
That really captures the essence, I think. The biology is the catalyst, sure, but the long-term success, the staying there part, hinges entirely on the psychological and narrative work.
Understanding identity shifts, anticipating the confusion, building that scaffolding through support.
And learning to view challenges not as failures, but as feedback. Those are the real keys, according to these reflections.
Well, this deep dive was really designed to give you, the listener, a shortcut to understanding these crucial, often overlooked aspects of the journey, the landscape that emerges after the physical transformation, and, importantly, how to navigate it successfully.
So, as you reflect on everything we've talked about today, maybe consider this. What narrative are you currently living? Or what narrative are you actively trying to build?
Yeah, and how is that story shaping your own journey of change, whatever that journey might look like for you personally? Something to think about.